Piano and Alexander Technique. It's one of my favorite subjects. Welcome. This is Open Mind Alexander Technique. I'm Jess. Piano is one of the instruments that I play. Today we're diving into what are some suggestions and challenges that come up with this particular instrument and how do we address them from the perspective of Alexander Technique. So I am extremely lucky that I happen to share my studio here at the University of Denver's Lamont School of Music with a piano professor. If I didn't, I would just be on a perfectly nice little Yamaha upright, but because I'm in one of the piano rooms, we've got two Steinway grands to play around with in here. So it's a rough life in here having to choose between which Steinway to play. I typically like the one by the window. When I have that open, I find it's nice and photogenic. It's a rough life. One of the really great things about sharing space with one of the piano professors is they've got all sorts of interesting piano teaching gear in here. So the piano professor here is Emily Book McGree. I think she's also head of like Colorado Music Teachers Association or something like that. She does a lot with music teaching around Denver. She is head of the piano pedagogy program here. So pedagogy is teaching teachers. So they bring in little kids in here all the time. So there's all sorts of little kid music teaching stuff in here, including this cool thing that I want to talk about. I've never seen this before. This is an outdoor welcome mat. It's one of the kind of squishy ones that's very grippy, and they put it underneath the pedals, and I love it. It's so great. It never would have occurred to me to do this. It's great. I find that my foot has so much more grip with the floor, and I like that it's slightly cushy, so my heel doesn't get as tired there for long periods of time. So highly recommend that one. Go and grab some sort of like really cheap outdoor welcome mat, foot mat. This is the kind that you like wipe your feet on to get mud off of your feet. Unfortunately, it's a dark color, and so are my legs and feet. So I'm going to move this just so that you can see my feet a little bit better, but just pretend this is there the whole time. It's wonderful. So the first thing that I work with piano players is being able to sit up independently. And this sounds very obvious until you look at how many piano players actually really struggle to do that. They might get very used to being at the piano for long periods of time. Yeah, absolutely. But it's not up. It's not upright. So one of the things that I have them play around with to learn where upright is to sit sideways on the piano bench, especially on these. These ones have nice cushioning along the sides. This is going to be a lot less comfortable if your piano bench is not padded, if it's just wood or plastic. And then the sides of those and the corners are really going to kind of dig into your thighs, and that's not comfortable. But on these really nice ones, sitting sideways and actually having the bench extend out a little ways in front of me really helps me find upright in a different way. The downside of this, of course, is you cannot use the pedals. So no, this is not a way that I would recommend people like really play piano. But this is a great way to practice being upright and being able to tilt. This tilt is vital for piano playing. So we're going to talk about the tilt and we're going to talk about spirals. If you've watched others of my videos, especially this series that I've been doing on working with different instrument types, we've been talking a lot about tilting and spiraling. So this comes up in tons of different instruments. This particular one is no exception. So what are the mechanics of this tilt? This is just rotating around the hip joints. So my hip joint is where the leg connects to the torso. That pivot point is pretty low. On me, it's about here. Everything above that tilts together. And I mean everything, the whole thing. The distance between my chin and my chest doesn't need to change. It can, if I want it to, but the way that I have my students practice this first is really getting a solid sense of where neutral is and being able to maintain that when their hands are on the keys. What this lets you do is have a whole menu of a range of different places where you can be compared to the keys, and they're all good places, right? So you do not have to stay at exactly 90 degrees compared to the keys, right? That's not reasonable. That's not how we play. And it doesn't help you look down. Looking down comes from your legs. So if I give myself a target here and pull up my beloved Debussy Children's Corner is my favorite Debussy suite there. If this is up here, and the music in this one goes up pretty high on the page, not on that page so much. So over here you can see this music goes up pretty high. I need to be able to look at that and then also occasionally down at my hands. That's pretty far. So how can I manage to do both? Please stay open. Okay, fine. How can I manage to do both? To see the top of this and my hands is going to be to stay back and use my eyeballs to look back and forth. This is also something I have my piano players practice, eyeball movement. So your eyeballs move in their sockets with muscles. Those muscles are called your extraocular muscles. There are also intraocular muscles, and those are the things that actually control the lens and the focus of your eyes, which is awesome. So your extraocular muscles are in between the eyeball and the bones of the eye socket. So they're right in there. They're really, really cool. Highly recommend you look up the anatomy of that. They're very neat. As with any muscle, those can get deconditioned or get very used to being in one particular place and have trouble moving from that if they're not frequently asked to move from that. How do you maintain range of motion in your muscles? Through consistent use of those muscles. So, how do we develop fluidity and fluency with being able to see hands up to the top of the page? By practicing looking at hands on top of the page with just the eyeballs. So, stay this way so you can kind of see my eyes here. So right now I can see my knees. That's about as far down. I can see here just a little bit, very peripheral, but that's about the limit. Conveniently, the piano keys are easier to see than that, so I do have farther range of vision than that. Just looking up, I can see the ceiling, and my music is not that far. So this range to look at can feel really far away if you're not used to moving your eyeballs. So consider eye practice to be part of piano training. So we've got eyes, we've got a tilt. What about that spiral I mentioned? The spiral is how you can reach both hands to the same octave at the same time. Now, this was an interesting one. I was doing this wrong for a very long time. Before my Alexander teacher training, just as a hobbyist piano player, until my Alexander technique teacher, Heidi Leithwood, informed me otherwise. So Heidi, my teacher, is a concert pianist. She's one of my favorite concert pianists. She doesn't really play much anymore. She's gone on to other pursuits since then. But she was really incredible. She has her doctorate in piano performance. And listening to her play was this unbelievably poised and light and delicate sound, and with absolutely zero unnecessary movements. It was really, really interesting. And one of the things that came up as I was working with her on piano stuff as part of my Alexander technique work was to be able to get both hands either quite high or quite low together without doing this. So what I've just done here, I'll just isolate it to the torso, is this. This is trying to get my rib cage to be several inches sideways of my pelvis. And this is called a bad plan. This does not go well. The reason that people end up doing this is because they're trying to get the same angle between their hands and the keys that they're used to. So they're trying to maintain parallel between the hands and the keys at all times. What Heidi encouraged me to do, and she said she also teaches this to her piano students as well, back when she had piano students, is not requiring the hands to be perpendicular to the keys. So not requiring straight angle between hands and keys. Allowing spiral. So if we're, for example, using the very high range of the piano, the left hand is going to end up nearly sideways. And then you base your fingerings on that. And it's going to change because now all of a sudden my thumb is not sideways compared to my fingers. Now, obviously, there are limitations to this. Not all piano rep is going to allow you to do that. But Heidi based the foundation of her technique and teaching on we're going to do things that are helpful for the human and not necessarily exclusively what might be your first inclination for what do I need to do with my hands? Well, I keep them perpendicular to the keys and therefore the whole thing needs to go sideways. So it's more like here. And then the opposite, going low, the right hand would be almost sideways. What that lets you do is spiral from all the way down to the hips. The whole thing goes up and over, the shoulders are going to rotate, and that sends my opposite hand over to get to where I need these keys to be. So let's look at that from the front. This spiral is up and over. And I'm really maintaining quite neutral in my spine. I'm not asking the middle of my spine or the neck to do any sharp bending forward, backward, or sideways. The whole thing goes together. The reason we use the term spiral is it gives us a good sense of something that is in motion and is maintaining length. So spiraling up and over, typically this will be with a bit of a forward lean as well, although not necessarily. You can absolutely still hit plenty of these notes. There's going to be a limit depending on how long your arms are, of course, and I'm not super lanky, so my arms are not crazy long. So for me, that's going to involve a forward tilt as well as a spiral. Same going the other direction. And that's something that if you are a piano player who is not used to doing that, that's going to take some practice. It feels really weird at first if you're very used to trying to keep your hands perpendicular to the keys and you've based your technique around that. So it almost looks like miming walking, right? So this is the key technique. And again, if you're playing chords that need to have the thumb up at the top, no, that's not going to work very well. And then, doing as much as you can to still maintain length up and over, even when you are really needing to reach with your thumb to get the thumb up and over. And allowing that to come from a spiral in the torso rather than trying to separate your upper torso from your lower torso into two chunks and trying to scoot the whole thing sideways. Other piano stuff that comes up, some of this does get back into just like basic piano technique, but the reason it's taught as basic piano technique is so you don't hurt yourself. Don't do this. It's a bad plan. This is tendonitis waiting to happen. So this is the same in lots of instruments. With me as a classically trained flute player, same thing. If you play your flute like this, with a sharp angle, if your arms are horizontal, we could describe this as having your wrists lower than your knuckles. Ideally, we want the wrist and the knuckles to be level or with the knuckles below the wrists. But roughly level, if you're looking at the back of the hand, top of the wrist, that's kind of what we're looking at there. Doing this asks all of these tendons, which do a lot of work when you're playing a piano, to be really stretched, and they don't like being there. So that's a tendonitis risk. And also just hurts after a while because it's very hard to exert enough pressure to pull the fingers back to get them off of the keys backwards if your wrist is so low. So keeping the wrists up is going to help with that a lot. So those are kind of the two biggest pieces for upper body. Let's talk a little bit about legs. So dealing with the pedals on a piano is an interesting challenge, and you are going to find people who have some different thoughts about it. I think that the folks who play piano in heels, as long as they're using a pretty similar height heel each time, totally fine. Not a problem at all. The difficulty is going to be if you're like oscillating wildly between like a very different height of shoes, then your ankle angle is going to be quite different at different times. So just having some consistency with that is generally a good plan. In the same way that like organ players, like pipe organ players, have like organ-specific playing shoes, it's to give them that consistency with what they're doing with their pedals. So when I'm working with my pedals and my legs, not allowing that to impact what I do with my torso. So this movement really should be independent. So no matter where this foot needs to go, even if it's shifting around, frequently the right foot is only going to be on the farthest right pedal, and it just goes up and down from there. But no matter whether this foot is tightened away from the pedal or let loose or pressing down on the pedal, right, we kind of have these three options. That doesn't need to impact my torso. And that's, again, something you can practice. So in the same way that beginner piano players need to really practice using both hands at once, and that takes time to build that skill, so does using the leg and the torso independently. What can happen is when the hip flexors tighten, that's on the front, so this stuff. So flexing the hip is bringing the knee closer to the chest up this way. That's flexion. Extension is the other way. If this fires, it'll pull on the torso, and some people will overcompensate for that by actually going backwards. And it creates a lot of extra tension that's not needed and not helpful. So when we're working with a pedal, I should be able to keep holding that pedal down no matter where my torso is. Notice that if I keep my hands on the keys and I do this tilt, my arms are going to go backwards, my elbows are going to end up further behind me than in front, right? That pivot happens from the shoulders, so keeping the shoulders pretty loose and not allowing the shoulders to creep up or in is going to be really helpful. So thinking about collarbones, allowing collarbones to be wide. Another way to think about collarbones that can be really helpful, they're kind of S-shaped. So it comes up and over, not distorting the S. So if it is really helpful to just look up a picture of collarbones, and then you'll kind of get a sense of what I'm talking about there. They're slightly S-shaped. And if you think while moving your arms about not distorting that S shape, it can help to leave this area alone. So allowing the collarbones to take up their own space means that we move the arms from way out where the arm bone, the humerus here, meets the shoulder joint, which is not at this little hollow space just in from the armpit. It can feel like that's where the arms move from because there's that empty space there, but that's actually the space between the whole shoulder girdle and the torso. So your actual, it's called the glenohumeral joint. It's where this bit connects to this bit. It's right in here. That's where this actually rotates from, including for doing this. We do not have to lift the shoulders or shrug in order to get the arms up. Likewise, we don't need to overcompensate and overperform, having a nice long neck and keeping the shoulders down, and this is the piano, right? This is tension. I am holding my shoulders down right now. That comes from below, mainly in the back and also in the armpit area. That's the difference. This hurts. This doesn't. So, leaving the shoulders alone and practicing bringing up the hands really slowly, both away from the pedal and with the pedal, so that all of these movements are in control. There's a wonderful quote that I printed out and stuck to the bulletin board over there. That's from a piano professor and incredible virtuoso player. Oh God, I'm going to mess up the name now. Marc-Andre Hamlin. God, let me check that. Marc-Andre Hamlin. Incredible player. I watched a great interview and discussion with him on YouTube. I'll put a link to it in the description. At one point he said that there's a story of someone who walked in on a very famous player, I think it was Rachmaninoff, practicing piano. And what he was doing was this. Over and over and over. Practice slow enough that you're aware of everything that you're doing and nothing is automatic. That's the quote. Practice slow enough that you're aware of what you're doing and nothing is automatic. When we get into automatic, we will do things we don't intend to do. So let's slow it down. Practice these different pieces in isolation. Leg, arms, hands, and eventually, once we can get those pieces really well managed, we can do some really fun stuff. So when we're working with this wonderful instrument, as neutral as possible is going to keep your technique sustainable long term. Working with a lot of horizontal motion in the hands and in the fingers, not trying to get huge pulling motions away from the keys. That's going to really tighten the back of your hands. If it doesn't look fluid, it probably isn't. So this is a great time to video your own playing. See what it looks like. Aiming for fluidity, aiming for ease, it's going to create a lot more healthy, sustainable relationship with the instrument.